Let's now learn the basics of the flex property, which is the property that we use in order to actually size flex items. And remember how I showed you in the Flexbox property overview how the flex property is actually a shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex spaces. And so let's now talk about each one of these three one by one. And to start, actually let me write that down here because this is really important to keep in mind. So removing this, let me just write that here, and also the default value. So the default for flex grow is 0. For flex shrink, it is 1. And for flex spaces, it's auto. So let's create a comment here, comment all of this out. Then here I will write defaults. And so like this, you can keep this here handy to check out this information in case we need it. And let's actually now start with flex spaces. So when we want to size flex items, and in particular with a width, then we usually do not use the width property, but instead we use flex bases. So let's say we want these elements to have a width of 100 pixels. Then, as I said, we use flex bases and set that to our width. So let's see. And what happened here is that now some of these elements do actually have a width of 100 pixels, but when the content is larger than 100 pixels, then the element actually extends to fit that content. So let's inspect that here. Here with the box model. And actually, even this element is not 100 pixels wide. So let's remove the gap that we have here to give ourselves some more space. Okay, and so that looks a lot better. So this one is now 100 pixels. This one is 2, and so is this and this. But then amazing is 120 pixels, and languages is even bigger at almost 150 pixels. So what this means is that flex spaces is not really rigid. So it's more like a recommendation that we make to the browser, but the browser will then, based on the content, figure out the optimal length. All right. And let's see what happens if we actually make this like really big, like let's say 200 pixels. Give it a save. And to see this effect a bit better, let's actually turn off this last element here. All right. And so you see that these three elements are the same size, I think. So HTML is 140, 140, 140, and in fact, all of them are 140 big. And so that's nowhere near 200 pixels, right? And the reason for that is that by default, Flexbox is allowed to shrink elements so that they fit the container. And so that's what the flex shrink here set to 1 actually means. So again, if there is not enough space in a container to fit the items with the size that we describe here using flex spaces, then Flexbox is allowed to shrink these items by default because flex shrink is set to 1. However, if we want to change that, which sometimes we might want, then we can simply set this to 0. And so now you see that they are indeed 200 pixels wide. But then, of course, the content no longer fits the container. All right. So setting flex shrink to 0 is not always advisable, but in some situations it's necessary. And we will actually come across one of those in our big OmniFood project later in the course. Okay. So essentially what flex shrink does is to determine whether Flexbox is allowed to shrink element if necessary or not. All right. And finally, there's also basically the opposite of that, which is flex grow, and which determines whether elements are allowed to grow as large as they can or not. So let's try that. So let's say flex grow set to 1. And in this case, it actually doesn't make much sense to have the flex spaces. But let's just see what happens in this situation. Well, now nothing changed. So let's actually turn this one here off. All right. And now you see that all of them have exactly the same size. And in total, they filled up the entire flex container. And so that's exactly what flex grow set to 1 is doing. Okay. So if we turn that off right here, then each of the elements would simply be back to occupying the width that they need to fit the content. But again, if we set flex grow here to 1, then all this remaining space right here is basically evenly divided by all the remaining elements, because all these elements now have flex grow set to 1. So in this situation right here. All right. But what happens if actually only one of these 5 here would have flex grow set to 1? Well, let's turn this off permanently. And then let's try, for example, here in the first element to set flex grow to 1. So again, first we had flex grow set to 1 on all of the elements, right? So that's why we used here the L selector, which are all of these elements. But now we are setting it only on the very first one. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, now only this element here was allowed to fill up all the remaining space. And so these 4 are still with the size of the content, and then the remaining space was filled up by this element. All right. Let's turn it back off here and back on here so we can see another thing. So setting flex grow to 1 on all of these elements here makes it so that they have the same size. And it wouldn't even have to be 1. What matters is that they are the same number. So if all of them would be 5, then they would still have the same size. Okay, but now if one of them was 2, so let's again try this one here. Well, then this one here would get double of the remaining space than these other ones. So let's see that. And so indeed, this now is a bit bigger than these other ones, right? So this one has 197 pixels, while this one has 108. So having this value here double the flex grow of the other ones doesn't mean that this one here will get double the size, okay? What it does mean is that it gets double of the available empty space than these other 4 ones. For example, imagine that the empty space was 600 pixels. Then this would get 100, and 100, and 100, and 100, and this one would get 200. And if we set it to something even bigger, then it would get an even bigger portion of the remaining space. Okay? But actually, usually what we do is to simply set flex grow to 1 on all of the flex items, because that's something very usual that we want. So basically having all the elements expanding in order to fill the empty space. And of course, there can still be a gap in between. Let's just use a smaller one so that we still have some space over. All right. And now finally, let's talk about the flex property itself, which remember is a shorthand for these 3. Now the flex property is actually pretty smart. So for example, we can simply set it to 1 like this, and then it will automatically figure out that this means that flex grow should be 1. So we don't need this, and usually we never do it like this. We always write just flex 1, and we then end up with the same result. So as a best practice, we should in fact never use one of these 3 here individually, but always use the flex property. Okay, so this one here is equivalent to using just this, but before, for example, when we had this situation right here, remember, So this, where the content doesn't even fit. But if we really wanted to do this, then we should actually still use the flex property. So the first value is flex grow, which is 0, and then we would set that to 0, because that is the default. Then the second value is flex shrink, which, remember, here we want it set to 0, so we would set that to 0, and then the last one is flex spaces, so this one we want at 200. And so that's it. We can then just turn off these two, and again the result is exactly the same. Okay, so always use the shorthand property and not one of these three here individually. Okay, now this one we don't want. Let's just leave this one here as we finish up this lecture. Now, I know that this is a lot to take in, and I'm sure that it all sounds pretty confusing at this point, especially this flex property. It actually took me quite some time to understand this one myself, and here we are really just scratching the surface. And so I don't really expect you to fully understand what's going on, but it was still important to introduce you to this property at this point so that we can then use it in our big project, and by then it will of course become a lot clearer.